China is firmly in US President Donald Trump's economic crosshairs. So wouldn't Beijing's biggest trading partner, the EU, be the natural counterweight in this economic tug-of-war? But Beijing doesn't seem all that willing to move in Europe's direction and sweeten the deal for Brussels. So what are we missing here? Are Chinese and European interests fundamentally incompatible? Well, to untangle the web of interests and relationships spanning Europe, the US, China, and its impact on Taiwan, we welcome back, speaking to us from Berlin, Claus Soong, an analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies. We also have Andreas Fulda, associate professor at Nottingham University. Andreas, I want to start with you. So China is in a difficult spot. I mean, everyone is, but China specifically. They are pressured by Donald Trump's America, even though the EU is their biggest trading partner, taken collectively. They have a production side overcapacity, but they can't offload everything to the EU or their no-limits partner, Russia. So it would seem that Europe is maybe not, holding all the cards, but at least has a strong hand. So to put it bluntly, why isn't Brussels putting the screw to Beijing?
The Europeans have actually tried to kind of level the playing field. Think of the comprehensive agreement on investment, which didn't go anywhere in the end, partly because the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want a level playing field. The Chinese government and its state-led economy seeks domination and should be described as a power trader. And as such, it seeks dominance in various industries, and that means it doesn't really aspire for an equitable economic relationship. And this is something the Europeans really have to understand. This is also what we discussed in relation to the threats facing the automobile industry and the demise of the solar industry.
So I'm going to stay with you here. Why is that? Why can't European leaders understand something that has been happening for decades now? Is it an unwillingness? Is it political interest that's dictating their actions or lack of actions?
Mostly it has to do with European strategic culture, the way we think about geopolitics, the way we think about geopolitical and geoeconomic threats. Threat perceptions are very uneven. We have also perhaps learned the wrong lessons from the past. There was an assumption that trade relations would smooth over relationships back in the days during the Cold War, leading to an end of the Cold War. Even the German Ostpolitik springs to mind. And many contemporaries think that this could still work, change to trade. But what we've had to learn in the case of Russia and Ukraine is that this hasn't come to pass. Radical revisionist regimes like Russia's, but also China's, they're willing to pay enormous economic prices for achieving their geopolitical goals. And this is something that few European leaders are willing to acknowledge and to draw the right lessons from.
So trade aside, Claus, do you think that the EU and China have any geopolitical interests in common currently in 2025?
It looks like that EU and China having a common trouble, Trump. But when we actually seeing the pattern about their foreign policy and their behaviors, actually, the common need to counter Trump does not align Europe and China together. I think the fundamental differences or obstacle between a bilateral relationship is China refusing to tackle what EU need the most in its economy and security interests. On economy, China failed to tackle on its overcapacity to address the European need. And secondly, on security front, China continuing alignment with Russia failed to address the European concern about its security architecture in Europe. So therefore, despite they having Trump in common that they don't like and have kind of facing pressure from Trump, no matter is the reshaping or in some way twisting the international norms, for example, on trade, Europe and China cannot align together in that sense. Europe and China have fundamental differences on their understanding about economy and security. So therefore, despite Trump, we don't see they both align properly, and their interests cannot go together that will divert the European away from its alignment or its ally system with the United States.
Andreas, you mentioned this earlier. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has reportedly told the EU High Representative Kaja Kallas in July that China does not want to see Russia lose in Ukraine because that would mean that the US would be free to focus entirely on China. Does that mean that any economic alignment between Beijing and Brussels is improbable or impossible, given how important Russian invasion in Ukraine is to the European community?
For many years, the mantra in Brussels has been China as a partner, competitor, and systemic rival. But Ukraine was really a game changer. And I think there is now a realization that this trifecta needs to be adjusted, and that the new trifecta should actually read competitor, systemic rival, and threat. Now I understand that many contemporaries in Europe do not like that term. They are concerned that threat frames could become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. However, China's support for Russia is already threatening European security. And as such, we have to actually live with that reality. It's not something that we wanted to see, but not responding to this threat means that we're basically trying to ignore it. But how can we ignore it? It's the elephant in the room. Putin would not have been able to wage this war without Chinese support. And that is something that we really have to keep in mind all the time when we're discussing these issues, that the Chinese leadership, diplomatic, economic, but also military support for Russia is really hurting European interests and European security. And we will have to respond to that.
Claus, can you tell us how important this no limits partnership between China and Russia, how much of that matters economically? How much can trade with Russia make up for potentially lost trade opportunities with Europe?
Yeah, I think it's very important we see that Chinese trade with Russia has become the lifeline for Russian economy to sustain the war machine in Ukraine. And we're seeing the surge of the trade since bilateral trades between China and Russia since the invasion of Ukraine happened about 3 years ago. We are also seeing that despite the Western sanction, we are seeing more the increase of the use of RMB in a bilateral rate. I think from 2 or 3% before the war till now about 40%. So China is the lifeline, economic lifeline to Russia. In that sense, we're seeing the economic-wise, China not just on trade, bilateral trade, but also on dual-use goods. So we see the increase on all these indicators that showing that China is supporting Russia in its war effort against Ukraine.
Well, Andreas, what about the other way around? China is very important for Russia right now. It's an economic lifeline. And what about for China? How important is Russia? Is it just a source of cheap raw materials and fuels, or is there something more that Russia could do for Beijing?
Russia is really important because this war of aggression against Ukraine is currently paralyzing Europe, creating a huge burden for the United States, which they don't want to carry because of their pivot to Asia. And we should not forget that the Chinese Communist Party has Taiwan in the crosshairs, and there are legitimate concerns that a prolonged war by Russia against Ukraine and by extension against Europe is very much in the interest of the party leadership in order to pave the way and to facilitate a possible military annexation of Taiwan. Now, I don't think that this will happen very soon, but in the current geopolitical climate, the current situation certainly benefits those in the Chinese Communist Party who have these plans. And they have never given up on Taiwan. They're actively planning for a military annexation. And so this is, I think, one of the biggest concerns that we have, that we will see two major wars, one in Europe, one in East Asia, which could then overwhelm the capabilities of the United States and its Western allies to basically fight two wars at the same time.
Oh, well, let's keep the focus on Taiwan because a lot of Taiwan's economic relationship with the EU was a part of Taiwan's chip diplomacy. But now with companies like TSMC rushing to invest more in the US, probably to avoid getting on Donald Trump's bad side, does that mean that there will be less money going around for investments in Europe that have been planned some time ago? We've already seen companies like Intel cancel their European investment plans. Claus, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we're seeing Trump is draining the flooding investment from other places in the world to or direct them to U.S. With the use of tariff and other measures to kind of coerce or encourage investment in the United States. And we are seeing that between Taiwan and Europe, that the fundamentals issue or the structure-wise is that Taiwan just don't invest that much in Europe. In vice versa, is actually Europe invest more in Taiwan, especially in the renewable energies in these days. In at least in the past 1 decade, we see a surge of that. And the question would be, what can Taiwan invest in Europe and have this functioning with the profit to return, despite that need, a huge need to pour money into the U.S. Market to invest there and to produce there. So I do think that would drive, like Trump's measure would driven out investment to Europe from Taiwan.
Well, the obvious answer to what can Taiwan give and offer and what Europe needs is chips. I mean, everyone wants chips, right? Andreas, how hungry for chips are European capitals? How much Brussels wants those, and how much can that help Taiwan maybe put it on the map a little more in Europe?
Well, during COVID, we've seen how dependent, for example, automobile manufacturers are indeed on chips. And the disruption of the global supply chains actually then led to frantic efforts to attract investment for chips manufacturing in Europe and in Germany in particular. And Taiwan has invested indeed now in Eastern Germany. But in my mind, it is a bit of a double-edged sword. The European dependency on chips made in Taiwan actually has given Taiwan some leverage in global affairs. By Taiwanese companies investing in Europe, to a certain extent, I think Taiwan is losing some of that leverage. But the thinking seems to be that if there was indeed a war in the Taiwan Strait, that Europe could be cut off from chips imports from Taiwan entirely. So they seem to be pursuing a hedging strategy. But whether this will help Taiwan geopolitically in the case of a military annexation, I'm very doubtful. And so the question remains still from a European perspective and a Taiwanese perspective, what can be done to prevent a military conflict, a war in Taiwan Strait?
Claus, So we're seeing a lot of maneuvering between the EU, China, US. What does that mean for other non-EU advanced economies? I'm thinking of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan here in East Asia. All three are members of the WTO, and Japan and South Korea do have free trade agreements with the EU, but not Taiwan. Do you think that might change at any point? Do you think Europe will look to Taiwan to defend this global trade, rules-based trade order together?
I think I'm more reserved on this. I think political factors plays a greater role here, especially with China. So we all know that these kind of issues need to be agreed by all member states of EU. And with the leverage China have in certain EU member states, that is a way that can be blocking the closer trade agreement or investment agreement to proceed further. And we're seeing that this is a too political sensitive issue for Europe to touch upon, to bypass that without having one with Beijing. We also see from the WTO cases, right? The WTO cases actually, Taiwan just joined right after China become a member of WTO. So I think that in a European mindset, it still does not yet have the preparedness to go straight with Taiwan without having an understanding from Beijing. So it's just getting more difficult. But I also think that from Taiwanese side, they might need to have more, to be a little bit strategic thinking in a way that is this have to be a mutual way to proceed rather than one way to pursuing, right? And if the question might be asked is, what does Taiwan get, right? When engaging with different partner, what does Taiwan get, right? Investing in Dresden, what does TSMC get, right? And I said, if you, in larger sense, if you are buying mutual funds, ETF, something like that, you are also those who invest in TSMC as a broad definition of stakeholder, right? You also want to ask, what do we get as a stakeholder? We invest in Dresden, and what can Dresden provide or Germany provide to Taiwan in general, right? Or EU in general, will it be offered, right? So I think that in theory, this might look like how do Taiwan and Europe engage together and how do you proceed with a trade agreement. But I think political factor still matters. In a practical sense, what can be done by the two sides might be to have more coordination, right? That does not require like everyone in the room to agree, right? If you're having something like a trade agreement between Europe and Taiwan, would you see Hungary will agree with that, right? I think that is a difficult scenario to expect. But for certain coordination, right, to smooth the bilateral relation, especially on trade and investment, I think that is something more doable without reaching the political significance to the 27 member state level. That is something both sides should work on.
We will unfortunately have to leave it there, but thank you very much, gentlemen, for shedding light on this very complex web of relationships. Claus Soong in Berlin and Andreas Fulda joining us from the United Kingdom.